Welcome to the 2021 Partners in Mission Self-Denial Campaign. This year, we're going to be highlighting the Zambia territory and various ministries in Lusaka, in Chikonkata, Livingston, and Ndola. The money that we raise will help to support the international work of the Salvation Army in over 130 countries. Together, we seek to raise $2.3 million as our territorial goal. May God continue to bless and use you as together we share the love of Jesus Christ beyond our borders. One Zambia, one nation, one army, one mission.
I want you to imagine for a second that you're in a garden. Can you picture it? Can you see the trees surrounding you, the flowers, the plants, all this greenery and life ebbing and flowing around you? Can you see the trees? Do you see how beautiful they are? Some that you just stare at, and some that have fruit for you to eat. Can you see the animals? The birds in the background singing their songs? Squirrels or chipmunks running past? Maybe the occasional deer walking past? All of these animals, they look at you, you look back at them. There's no fear. There's no worry of who's going to encroach upon whose space. There's just peace and acceptance and acknowledgement that we are both here in this space. As they continue on their way, you just sit in the shade of that beautiful tree, enjoying the day, enjoying the creation around you, and enjoying being with the Creator. God created all of creation, and then He shared it with humanity, who He created. He shared it with us by giving us the ability to rule creation with God. He created us in His image, and He gave us access to His presence, to His wisdom, and to His life. And all He asked of us was that we don't eat from one tree. And if we ate from that one tree, we would surely die. A tree that leads to death. When God created the world, He created humanity, and He gave them a choice. He gave them a choice to see how they were going to choose to rule with God. It was a test. But don't tests seem cruel? Like, why would a good God need to test humanity? The reality is that not all tests are bad. I think probably because of our experience in school, we tend to have a very negative emotional reaction when we hear the word test. But the impact of a test really depends upon the intention of the one who's giving the tests. A test can be an opportunity. If the person giving you a test wants for you to succeed, wants for you to show your true trustworthiness or your character or what you've come to know, it's an opportunity. It's a good thing. This test is a great opportunity. However, on the flip side, we can have someone who gives us a test with it being a trap. That person wants us to fail the test. When we look at the creation story at the beginning of the Bible, in Genesis 3, we see that there's this test that's given to humanity. God wants us to succeed in the test. He wants us to pass the test. He wants us to prove that we are trustworthy, that our character is true, and that we are willing to trust God before ourselves. The snake, on the other hand, also was testing humanity. But the snake wanted humanity to fail the test. And as you may know from the story, we did. Humanity failed the test. Sin entered the world, and we showed that we couldn't pass the test on our own, that our character wasn't able to pass the test, that we needed help to do that. While humanity failed the test and was exiled as a result, God promised that one day a human would come, a human who is able to pass the test, pass the ultimate test. And it says in Genesis 15 that he would stomp on the head of the snake, but the snake would also bite him. So God promised that while you have failed to pass the test, I will make sure that someone will come who can do that. That's Genesis 3. Then in Genesis 4, right away, following that story, we see God giving humanity another chance to pass the test. With Cain and Abel, we see that Cain is given a choice. But what happens? He also fails the test. Generation after generation, God gives his people a chance to pass the test. And there are some people who actually don't always fail the test. When we look at the story of Abraham, God asks him to leave everything behind. Leave your family, leave everything, leave your land, and come follow me. And at first, Abraham actually passes that test. But then as time goes on, he lies, he cheats, he schemes to try to subvert God's plan and do it his own way. He starts to fail the test again and again, until we get to the ultimate test for Abraham, which you might remember from the story of him being asked to sacrifice his son. God had promised that Abraham's seed would become a multitude, that he'd be a family of many nations. His family would outnumber the stars and the sand. And now his one and only son, God is asking him to sacrifice. But this time, Abraham passes the test. So Abraham was able to pass a test, but he wasn't proven to be the ultimate test passer, not the one that God had promised. And then we look at Moses, another great character in the Bible. And he was given a choice, a test, right by a fiery bush or a tree. And while eventually Moses says, okay, I'll do it, it took some no's before. So we see this time and time again where the people of God are given a choice, a test is put before them, and they fail. While sometimes they might succeed, ultimately they always just fail again. Exodus 16 and the story of the people of Israel coming out of Egypt and in the wilderness is stories of tests being put in front of them and them continually failing. Continually failing, complaining that we don't trust why God brought us out of Egypt. And we have this cycle of people being given an opportunity and failing. An opportunity to trust God, to follow God, but they ultimately fail, which leads further and further into exile. The point of all of this, and the point of this test, is that nobody is able to pass the test. No one is able to pass the test and defeat the snake, step on its head, and be the trustworthy human that will rule creation with God. That God promised in Genesis 3:15, nobody in all of Israel's history was able to do that. Which brings us to Jesus. And throughout Jesus' story, throughout his life, we're given these stories of Jesus being tested. Right at the beginning of Matthew's gospel, after he's baptized, he's taken out into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, and he's tested. But Jesus passes the test. Jesus is continually tested. Throughout his life, he has opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to show that he is the trustworthy human, and every time he passes. Which brings us to the story that we're going to read today, found in Matthew 26. This is the ultimate test. This is where the rubber hits the road. This is the test. So I'm going to read it for you. Feel free to read along with me in your Bibles. It's Matthew 26, verses 36 to 46. And it says this: Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee and began to be grieved and agitated. Then he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me." And going a little further, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." And then he came back to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So could you not stay awake with me for 1 hour? Stay awake and pray, that you may not come into the time of trial, the time of testing. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again he went away for a second time and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." Again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for a third time, saying the same words. Then he came back to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." The story of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Just prior to Jesus going into the garden, we know that they've just had the Passover meal together. Judas has left to go and betray Jesus. Jesus has predicted his own death to the disciples again, and they're confused. They don't understand what Jesus is saying. They've had the Last Supper together, and now they find themselves in the garden. And Jesus knows what's coming. He knows what's about to happen to him. And he's so overwhelmed and grief-stricken that he goes to pray. He goes to pray, and he struggles and wrestles with what God has before him. But, as we see in verse 39, Jesus chooses God's will. He says, "Not my will, but yours be done." 3 times in this story, we see that Jesus chooses not his will, but God's will. We know from this story it says, "My Father." In the Gospel of Mark, it says, "Abba," which is kind of like saying daddy. It's this very, very intimate way of connecting with God. So we know that Jesus is in this place of testing, but he's sitting in this deep, intimate relationship with God. And he struggles in that. But from this deep relationship, he's able to say, "Not my will, but yours be done. And that allows for him to be obedient and to pass the test time and time again. So Jesus struggles in prayer, ultimately choosing God's will over his own. And then he comes back in verse 40 and he finds the disciples asleep. He had asked them to do one thing, to just stay awake with me because I'm really struggling. And they fell asleep. The disciples had a test before them, but they fell asleep. And this happens 2 more times in the story, like I said, where Jesus goes and wrestles in prayer with God, and the disciples fall asleep continually when Jesus needs them to stay awake. Jesus asks them to stay awake with him, and they continually fall asleep. So what do we get from this? What is this story showing us? It shows us a lot of things, and we could spend a lot of time talking about all the depth that is in this story. But the one thing that I really want us to take from this today is that this story shows us 2 responses to a test, 2 choices that are made. Jesus provides us an example of what it means to live in obedience and trust with God. He shows us what it looks like to live out of a deep, intimate relationship with God and choose ultimately to trust God over myself. Jesus wrestles with God. He struggles with God. He knows what's ahead and he doesn't want to do it. So we see this wrestling and the struggling, but ultimately he chooses God's will over his own. And then he moves forward in action and in courage, knowing that God can be trusted. That God's plan and God's will is ultimately bigger and better than what I would choose for myself. Jesus is the one who passes the test. And we know that he's the one who steps on the head of the snake, but is bitten. The ultimate test comes when Jesus dies on the cross. And again, Jesus passes that test. The second response to a test that we see is that of the disciples. And the disciples show us how weak our flesh is, how weak our humanity is, and how by ourselves we are unable to pass the test. Like Jesus says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. It doesn't really say a whole lot about what happened for the disciples. Maybe Jesus was gone for an hour, and while they spent the first half an hour praying, it's the middle of the night, so maybe they just accidentally fell asleep. Maybe they really wanted to stay up with Jesus, but they just couldn't do it. Or maybe they just didn't understand what was going on, and so they decided to take a nap while they waited for Jesus. We don't know. We don't really know the motives behind the choice that was made. But what we know is that the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. By ourselves, we cannot pass the test. By ourselves, we will always fail to choose God's will over our own. Like we see play out time and time again in the Old Testament. They couldn't stay awake. They were asleep in choosing the will of God, which meant that Jesus was struggling by himself. We're coming up on Easter weekend. We're 2 weeks away from Easter weekend, which means we are continuing in the season of Lent, journeying towards the cross with Jesus, trying to put ourselves in the place of Jesus and understand somewhat what he was going through, to understand his struggles, to understand his feelings, and to understand what he did. And this week, that puts us in the garden with Jesus. We are in the garden with Jesus. And we have a choice. We have a test before us. The reality is we face tests every day where we get to choose whether we are going to rule creation with God, choosing God's will over our own, or if we're going to choose our will, where we're going to fail the test, where we're going to choose the path that leads to death. But Jesus gives us an example of what it looks like to trust God in a radical and new way. Because God every day is giving us an opportunity to trust Him. An opportunity to show that we are trustworthy, that we believe He is trustworthy. And the beautiful thing is that we don't have to do it alone. The flesh is weak, but the Spirit is willing. Praise the Lord that we don't have to do it alone, because the Spirit struggles with us. The Spirit is with us. And in those moments where we are struggling, where we don't know how to choose the right path, the Spirit will enable us. The Spirit will give us strength to choose. Like Jesus, out of a deep relationship with God, we can choose to surrender to God's wisdom and Jesus' love and be more like Jesus. And so the test is before us all. An opportunity to be united with God as He intended. Sin is powerful, and it's not a simple test. But there is hope. We have hope because the test ultimately has already been passed. Jesus passed the test. He stomped on the head of the snake, and He was bitten for us. Jesus came to do the work that we as humanity could not do, and He reunited us with God, restoring our divine purpose and the ideal that God set up in the garden. And so the test every day is before us. Are we going to choose our will, or are we going to choose God's will? Will we take wisdom on our own, or will we let God give us the wisdom that we need? Will we be like the disciples, falling asleep, spiritually asleep? Or will we be like Jesus, in a deep relationship with the Father, that we can say, not my will, but yours be done.
Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only